What is your role in creating an inclusive workplace in these uncertain times? If you're still struggling with that and if you still look for orientation, this class is for you. Hi, my name is Ingo Rao. Welcome to the School of Becoming. In this month's series, we are talking about activating inclusion on an individual, interpersonal, leadership, organizational, and cultural level. Together with a board of advisors and Manage Magazine, we are bringing you 10 sessions that focus on helping you to take inclusive action at work and beyond. Today's guest is Jennifer Brown. Jennifer is the founder and CEO of Jennifer Brown Consulting, as well as a speaker, author, and advisor to large organizations and managers who seek to lead more inclusively. She wrote 2 books on the subject, one called Inclusion, the other one, which is very much in line with the series, is How to Become an Inclusive Leader. With that, welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you so much, everybody. This is wonderful. Yes, please, Ingo, thank you, and Lauren, and thank you for everything you do and that you dedicate to the School of Belonging and bringing knowledge to all of us. I really am grateful to you for doing that, and I know that it's a labor of love. And so I'm happy to be here. I'm dialing in from New York City, where I live. I've lived here for over 20 years. And so I really did want to know where people are dialing in from, and so I can appreciate the geographical diversity on this call today. And also, as Ingo said, I'd love to hear your questions about this topic. So, what made you interested enough that you made the time for this session? You know, what would you like to learn about? Are there any terms or language you would like me to try to explain from my viewpoint? And certainly, I'm a specialist in how this looks in the organizational context. And so I think a lot about management and leadership. I think about organizational change and readiness for the diversity, inclusion, and equity conversation or not. I think about the evolution of organizations towards cultures of belonging. And I'm going to steal the word becoming. I would say that we are all kind of this year, especially becoming, right? We're figuring out, what do we stand for? How do we want to lead? What are we learning, and how are we going to incorporate that into our organizations, into our personal path, right? Into our personal careers. So yeah, it's a really fascinating time to be working in this space, and I look forward to answering any questions that you have. And thanks so much for weighing in. Hello, welcome, Mike from Toronto. We have folks from Alberta. Wonderful startup that focuses on inclusion. Great, Ed. Good to hear. Yeah, there's actually a lot of new companies coming into this space with new technologies, new products, things that are meant to help our organizations move along their journey that accelerate that make it scalable. For example, there's some amazing anti-bias tools that are coming out that use AI to look at language in job descriptions and performance reviews and blinding resume names and educate. It's fascinating. It's a super dynamic space. So I'm thrilled that I think this space needs the human piece and also the tech piece to really create sustainable change. So little help with burnout. Absolutely, Shannon. I'm happy to share a little bit about that. Yes. The challenge of this work on a personal level is I've been in it for a long time, and it's there's like elation and like depression and everything in between. And just sustaining the level of attention that this topic is getting right now has been really an interesting challenge, but also incredibly invigorating for me and my team. So just so you all know, I have a team that spans, they're all over the US. So they're West Coast, East Coast, South, Midwest, and Europe as well. And we sort of are fanned out at any given day, consulting virtually, building D&I strategies for companies, designing and delivering training a lot, working on ERGs. So I would assume a lot of you know what ERGs are, or affinity groups, but those are employee resource groups. ERG or BRG comes by different names, but those are groups of identity-based employees that form in companies and that serve a certain purpose. Very important groups that exist in many larger companies, I would say, but more and more smaller companies are starting to invest in structures like this as well. So I'm happy to answer any questions about that too. Thank you so much. I'm glad to meet all of you in chat. So I'm going to share my screen here. Thanks so much, Ingo and Lauren. And let's do this. So I wanted you all to have my information all in one place. So I wanted to start with my QR code. If you want to screenshot this with your phone, and it will take you to a bunch of different things that are resources. So as Ingo mentioned, I'm an author. I have two books, one that came out in 2017 and one that came out in 2019. Both on the topic of inclusion and inclusive workplaces. And then I also have a podcast called The Will to Change. I have a free download of the first chapter of the second book for everybody if you're interested in that, and other goodies. So we also have an assessment that you can take. And a little bit later, I'll talk about the inclusive leader continuum, which is the sort of centerpiece of the second book. We have an assessment that's free that takes about 10 minutes for you to take to understand where you are in the journey according to the model that we created. And I hope that's helpful too. So I'm happy to provide that as we go. Just to give you an idea, the podcast is called The Will to Change. The download, and again, this is in the QR code, but just to give you an idea of what's there. Our mailing list information and the inclusive leader continuum is down here. And again, I'll come back to that in a little bit, but just wanted to let you know. I'm so dedicated to supporting this work, and I want you all to feel equipped and energized, and we need you. We need all of our voices in different ways to promote this work, to push it along, to make sure that we're all going together, and we're all sort of including everyone in the work too, which is a big piece that I'm passionate about, and I'll explain why in a little bit. But that's just really critical that we all go together. And I don't know if we really have done that very well in the past. So it's something I think that needs to change. So let me share a little bit about my personal story. I actually was an opera singer. I was aspiring opera singer. And so I moved to New York in my 20s. And that was why I ended up here in the city to make it, quote unquote. So I studied opera. I got a master's in vocal performance. And everything was great. And I was really excited about my future prospects, but I ended up injuring my voice through the training, which is really arduous, as you can imagine. And I ended up having to get several vocal surgeries. And the aftermath of that is complete silence for a period of weeks. And then you work to bring your voice back. But it is forever changed. I think every time that happens, it becomes progressively, I think, weaker with less stamina. And so I recognized the writing was on the wall. I realized I would probably have to find something else to do with my life and my gifts and my energy. And so I followed some ex-performers into what would become my field of expertise and my passion, which was into the world of leadership development. And I entered that world because I liked being in front of audiences. And I didn't realize that I could actually be training those audiences on leadership. And so I got a second master's degree in organizational change, leadership development, learning and development. And I held a series of HR roles for a period of years in-house internally as an employee. And then I was laid off in a restructuring. And I thought, I think I want to be an external consultant with my own voice. I think it's going to be important for me to shape what that looks like and have that autonomy. And so I would build my own company subsequently, Jennifer Brown Consulting, that Ingo mentioned. And, these days, 13 years later, we get to build workplaces and help our clients build workplaces where all of us can bring more of our full selves to work, where we can thrive, where we can feel a sense of belonging, and where we feel welcomed, valued, respected, and heard. So I like to say I was meant to use my voice, just not as a singer. But the other way I wasn't using my voice that I want to share is that I'm a member of the LGBTQ plus community. So I came out when I was 22 and I'm now late 40s. So long time ago, very different time. Thankfully. But I was very closeted as a performer and selectively shared that information because I thought gigs would be on the line, relationships would be on the line. And then as an entrepreneur, of course, I worried that I wouldn't be accepted in the business world if I shared who I was. And, this is still something I carry with myself to this day, which is that like wondering about the psychological safety that we have in any given room. And even these days, I walk into rooms and I'm the only woman. I look at and making assumptions again, because we're not always sure. But I think, I know I'm being probably perceived as a female identified individual. And then I'm also LGBTQ, and I'm wondering if anyone in that room even knows that about me or isn't familiar, or whether it will trigger biases, right? So those are things I walk into the room. One is my visible diversity of my gender, and then my invisible diversity, which is LGBTQ. I am kind of assessing whether or not I am going to be able to speak and be believed and have credibility, or whether I'm going to have to work extra hard to build that. And, I read some research, and I want to share that research with you today, that gave me a name for this dynamic of being in places where we are the only, or where we have invisible diversities that we believe are stigmatized. And that is the concept of covering. So this is Kenji Yoshino and Christy Smith's concept that they worked on a research project with Deloitte on. From a couple of years ago. And it means downplaying a known stigmatized identity. So by stigmatized, I mean, the categories we typically think of as underrepresented or marginalized. For me, that might be gender in a male-dominated world as a woman, and it may be LGBTQ plus in a very heteronormative world. Interestingly, I also identify as a cisgender person, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. And so in that way, I'm actually more a part of the majority. I'm also perhaps more part of the majority in terms of my ethnicity, right? Working across corporate America, as I mainly do, it is dominated at the leadership positions by straight, white, cisgender men. And that's just a fact. And then we have a lot more visible and invisible diversity in the sort of more emerging talent or early in career community, right? So if you think of organizations as a pyramid, you've got a lot of diversity in the bottom third or even half. And then it kind of, winnows out as you move up, and then you face entirely male management teams or entirely white management teams with maybe a woman or a person of color. So typically that's where I'm coming in and working with those groups who are asking the question of how can we be better? And that's a complicated question to unpack, because a lot goes into the creation of that. And then we have to start really thinking very systemically and strategically about, like, how do we want to change that? And so covering gave me a word for how I was playing smaller and how I was making the adjustments in anticipation of bias in a room. And it may, as you're listening to this, you may be relating to the concept of covering. And as I go through this, I would love to hear from those of you on the call, how does this show up for you? Perhaps it showed up for you earlier in your career. Perhaps it still does. Perhaps it's situational, depending on the manager you're working with, the company you're working in, and how overt they are about their commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion or not. So a lot of this can kind of come and go over the course of our careers, depending on a lot of these factors. And so let me go into the research a little more. There's 4 A's of covering that they talk about in the report, which, by the way, is called Uncovering Talent. And you can actually look it up. It's a PDF that you can download. Welcome, Heather from Albuquerque. I'm just greeting everybody as we come in. So let me go into these momentarily and talk about how often we do this and, what kind of toll it takes on us, because I think that's what's most important. Is 61% of us report covering on a regular basis along one of these axes. So for appearance-based covering, it might be, how I wear my hair. For people of color, women of color in particular, we talk about the choices about hairstyle tend to kind of bleed over into our performance and how we're perceived. There is this notion of professional hair, if you will, that's not natural, for example. So sometimes women of color will say, I'm very intentional about how I wear my hair in this workplace culture that, I understand that it's going to trigger some biases if I wear it in the way that I want to wear it. So I wear it in the way that I think I need to wear it, or I dress in a certain very formal way. It can also be sort of how we appear more feminine or more masculine in terms of our appearance and fitting into what's expected of us versus challenging what a woman dresses like, what a man dresses like, et cetera, right? And we know that there's so many changes in terms of just appearance in our younger generations, right? There's so much more desire to bring their full selves to work in all of their gender expression and all of their non-binary gender identity as well, right? And yet our workplace is really set up to embrace that and to even understand that. Affiliation-based covering is a distancing from a stigmatized group. So not wanting to be affiliated. And I think before the pandemic, I always used to use the example of parental leave, and particularly how fathers would not take advantage of leave that's offered by their company. And this was a global phenomenon, but the stigma of the things that would be said about us, i.e., I'm not committed to my job. Like if I ask for flexibility, if I take all that time, will I be negatively judged about my commitment to my career? And so there would be this distancing of being affiliated with parents, right? Even though you are one. And so I don't talk about it. I don't ask for the accommodation that I need or want. I don't talk, I make things up to avoid drawing attention to my parenting. And interestingly, in the pandemic, of course, we're all on display on video all the time, and our lives are unfolding around us. And so I think that this has actually gone a long way towards destigmatizing parenting and really showing how difficult parenting is in the best of circumstances, let alone in a pandemic, and has really, I think in some ways exacerbated gender inequality in terms of the roles that we play at home and the responsibility. But on the flip side, I think, the participation of both genders, all genders in parenting has also, I think, been a big learning point for a lot of people. And so anyway, it's a mixed bag, as this year has been in many ways. Advocacy-based covering is when we don't make a big deal about jokes, comments, things that are inappropriate, things that make us feel smaller or, microaggressed, as we say a lot. When we hear those microaggressions, we can choose whether to speak up or remain silent. And I think when we advocate for our own selves, we can get a reputation as somebody who is angry, somebody who's annoying. We're drawing attention to our diverse dimensions by speaking up. And so some of us avoid doing that. After a while, we get tired of bringing it up, et cetera. We have a great question in here. Let me just pause 1 second. And yes, please share how covering shows up in your life, please. Personally, professionally, both are fair game. How do we play small about what we are, who we are, how we identify visible and invisible aspects of our diversity? I would love to hear in chat. How many genders do we recognize? Mike, it's a great question. It really just depends how deep you want to go into this topic. I think the most important thing is not the number of genders, but really creating room for those who identify as non-binary. So the female identify, male identify is a binary, right? Those are two ends of a continuum. And we now understand gender identity to be a continuum. So when we hear gender non-binary individuals or gender fluid individuals, they don't identify on either end of that spectrum. So I, as a cisgender woman, identify as female, and I'm cis or cisgender because my sense of my gender, which is female, matches the gender of the body I was born in. So there is an alignment there. And cis, CIS, means same in Latin. So cis is the opposite of trans. Those are two ends of the continuum, but we understand that there's a lot of gender identities in the middle. And in fact, I think we are probably a lot of us on that continuum somewhere, and not absolutely a binary one way or the other. And that would probably be true about sexual orientation as well. So thank you for that question. And thank you, Anna, for providing a definition of the microaggressions. Yeah, that's a really big question, and something I would task you all with, which is to understand the common microaggressions that are faced by different communities of identity. So if you're sitting here listening to me right now and you're like, what does she mean? Please read up on microaggressions. Please understand and kind of commit to memory the things women hear, the things LGBTQ people hear, the things that Black individuals hear. They are comments, jokes, questions can be a microaggression. So just to sensitize yourself to those, but it's not that hard. You just need to study them and understand that when you hear them, they need to be ideally corrected in a constructive format. Of course, I would not say we need to make a big deal and shame people and embarrass people for microaggressions, but it is an educational process. And remember that your colleagues that are impacted by microaggression are probably really tired of the advocacy, and hence the advocacy-based covering, right? So this is where a lot of us can be more active allies to say, name a microaggression when we hear it, give somebody that feedback in an appropriate, gentle way, and hold the grace and space for them to realize, oh my goodness, I didn't realize that. I will do better. That's what we really kind of ideally want the system to function as. Yes, absolutely. Yes. Thanks, Mike. Yes, we all could. Trust me. Yes. And Zach, thank you. It also goes by micro inequities. Absolutely. I have friends who call them macro aggressions. It's not always micro, right? And sometimes it's just straight up aggression. Like sometimes it's not unconscious bias, it's conscious bias, right? So there's a lot of room for all kinds of unpleasantness, but this is how we learn. This is how we learn, and we've all been on both sides of these things. So it's really a learning process to be, I think, patient with ourselves and others around, and know that sometimes all it takes is one conversation with someone to say, "Hey, when you say that, here's the impact on people," and then for that person to respond to say, I don't want to have that impact, and I'm going to change my language. Thank you for telling me, which is ideal. Association-based covering, just to finish this slide, is the avoidance of being seen around too many people of our identity. So it may mean like I'm an LGBTQ manager and I tend to hire, maybe I have a higher percentage of LGBTQ people on my team. Somebody may say, oh, Jennifer, she's LGBT and she only hires LGBT. She seems to have a bias towards people that, look like her or whatever. And if I know that that's being said about me, I'm going to avoid that association. I'm going to literally put extra effort towards making sure that I can never be accused of positive bias for my own identity. So that's association-based covering, like don't want to be associated with a stigmatized group. And so what was really fascinating to me is to understand this took a lot of energy from me. It wasn't nothing, to walk around and anticipate bias, whether it's real or not. Its perception is reality. And it was a heavy burden. And so I wanted to share a little bit more in the research. Those of us in the U.S. context, we think about diversity in a lot of ways, but the ways right here on this slide are really the ethnicity, gender identity, disabilities, our gender, as I said, and we could go on and on with different identities, but these are just some of the numbers. And you'll notice that they're higher. So these are the percentages of, people in these communities that report covering on a regular basis. For LGBTQ, I'll just say we are, many of us are closeted in the workplace. So the statistics last year from the Human Rights Campaign, which is kind of the arbiter of the community's progress in the workplace, says that nearly 50% of us are closeted in the workplace. So you talk about covering all day long, covering who you love, modifying your appearance, not standing up for yourself. If you're closeted, you don't want to do any of those things because you don't want to draw attention to yourself. And so that community is a particularly good at, in a heartbreaking way, good at covering, because until last June we could get fired. In 35 US states, we could have gotten fired for being LGBTQ unless our company had protections. So that was a Supreme Court ruling that went in our favor in June. And then some of you may or may not know, but being gay is a crime punishable by death and imprisonment in many countries around the world. So there's like real stuff behind this. And no matter how progressive a company can be, I think we still sort of absorb the messages of our childhood and what's outside of our progressive company, if we're lucky enough to work for one. And we bring that fear inside, right, to the organization and to how we behave. Thank you, Tamara Pierce, for sharing that. I appreciate that. Yes. I thank you for that experience, that share. That's exactly real. And I'm glad I've given you a name for that, right? You're not imagining that. That's why I love the covering research. It's so spot on. And I really encourage all of you to read it. And if somebody can find the link maybe and share it in chat, that would be great. It's called Uncovering Talent. And you'll see it'll probably come up under Deloitte's information, and maybe you can share the link in chat. But I swear you will see yourself in this research. It's really powerful. So this other group was studied in Uncovering Talent, which I really appreciated and sort of was a big aha for me, which is this group. So 45% of straight white men report covering as well. And these are some examples. The thought bubbles are actually things that I've heard from people. They whisper them to me, they confide in me. If I create the space, often things, thank you, Anna, for sharing that. These things won't be shared in a group because the pressure to conform is really strong in these groups as well. But that there are a lot of diversity dimensions that are going on underneath the waterline, as I'm going to explain in a minute. And so even depending on where you are in the world, it depends the sort of what's accepted in your company, the industry you're in, even for the US, the part of the US you're in. There are certain things that are, you'll see diversity dimensions that are swept under the rug. Religion, spirituality, addiction, mental health issues, socioeconomic background, want to be a stay-at-home parent, stay-at-home dad, being LGBTQ, or having a loved one who's in the community and not talking about it at work. So there's a lot going on, and I really appreciated. This was a check on me to read this in the research to say, like, when I walk into a room like this, I might make assumptions about how much I need to cover, and I may make an assumption that I don't have anything in common with these folks just based on what I see. And there's a lot of diversity dimensions going on in every single group of people, even if they look this way. So that's an important thing to carry with us, that inclusion needs to include everyone, and that there is so many invisible aspects of diversity. So our diversity work needs to be more holistic. It needs to be more far reaching. And we are kind of, I think, having a year like that where simultaneously we can focus on the Black Lives Movement, which is so critical and overdue. And we can hold all the other identities that contribute, that exist, by the way, in the Black community, that exist in the LGBTQ community. And we can think about things that run across all of our identities as well. Things like mental health, things like parenting, things like addiction issues, and other things that are impacting us right now. So, yes. And yeah, good question, Mike. What about intelligence? So many different kinds of intelligence. I might say there's a diversity of intelligences also. Intelligence, I think, is very situational in terms of where you might shine and where you don't. And this gets a bit to your question, Mike. So we are this, massive number of things that make us up, both visible and invisible. And when I teach this, my goal is to really make sure everybody feels that they have a connection point into this, because like I alluded to earlier, I think we've kind of sprinted forward with the diversity conversation and also made it about gender and race and ethnicity. And less so a lot of other aspects that really show up and have a powerful impact on our ability to perform and feel energized and feel that sense of belonging where we all can be creative. So primary aspects of diversity are inborn. They are things that we cannot change, whether they're visible or not, are known to ourselves or not. I would argue they are innate, right? Our gender, our true gender, might not match the gender of the body we were born in, but our true gender, our abilities, if we were born with a disability, our sexual orientation, many of us would argue it's innate, our age, our ethnicity. Now, can I pass as another ethnicity than my true ethnicity? Possibly, but it is innate, right? It's unchangeable. It's inborn. So secondary diversity then is the acquired diversity. I think these are life stage. They are accidents of birth. Was I born into means? Was I born into safety? Was I born into a family that could afford education? Or was I the first in my family to go to college, for example? Was I raised by a single parent? What religion was I born in? Where did I grow up all over the world? So a lot of these things inform us powerfully, and yet many of them are invisible, interestingly. So secondary aspects are these acquired aspects, but then it keeps going. Organizational diversity, senior, junior, headquarters location, regional location. Did I have a non-traditional educational background, or did I have another career before I ended up here? Industry background can be something people cover because they are afraid of showing that they are not necessarily of the same cloth that a lot of people in our organizations are from a training perspective or degrees, et cetera. You could be a PhD and hide it because you don't want people to feel uncomfortable around you. So it's something, that you attained that you instinctively downplay. because that's not the kind of environment you work in today. So lots of different, choices there. And then cultural diversity. I find this fascinating. My partner is Filipina American, first generation, grew up here in New York, and noticing the difference between my Northern European culture and our, just to pick one thing, our sort of task orientation, and to look at her culture and experience this multi-generational, very collective culture that's not an individualistic culture, but really more of a multi-generational, family comes first, relationship-based culture, leads to, potentially different dynamics in terms of how we lead, how we are colleagues, how we manage across diversity, and really like take off our own lens and try to see things through other lenses of cultural beliefs and norms and habits and behaviors, right? And then finally, era diversity. So I find this really fascinating. In the US, the millennial generation is the oldest of them are coming into their late 30s. And then the Generation Z behind them is the oldest of whom are now about 24 or 25. So we've got these generations both in the workplace, early career, moving up, and then we've got this next generation coming in. I can tell you that the values around diversity, equity, inclusion are strong in this group. And any of you have young people in your life, you know this, that we of Generation X are behind. Baby boomers are really behind. And we have to make a lot of effort to kind of broaden our view around what we were taught and what we thought was appropriate and what we meant around bringing our full selves to work are not very different, So we have this younger generation that prizes, I think, inclusiveness, and it's bringing a sea change to workplaces and to employers who I think aren't frankly prepared for this generation, all that they're bringing. And, it's challenging. It's not all good and it's not all easy, but I personally think it's going to kind of, cause a sea change in terms of how we talk about this, how we teach it, whether we need to teach it, because you might argue this generation's coming in saying, yeah, diversity and inclusion, of course. I want to belong here. I'm going to bring my full self to work in the interview. And, that boldness, that embracing of the authentic parts of ourselves is, I think, quite a foreign concept for some of us that compromised a lot to bring our full selves to work historically and got very different messages about whether we would be valued and seen and heard in organizations. So we're in a really interesting period of change. And let me just pause for a moment and just read some of these great concepts. Thank you for Cecile. Thank you for that reference. I had not heard about Winnicott's work, but I will definitely look that up. The true self and the false self, right? I would say that the work self and the life self, right? And the fact that the blending of those things now that we see, particularly in younger generations, that it's sort of always on 24/7, get the work done, when I get it done, and sort of that want for autonomy, agency, is an interesting blending. I think that, again, older generations thought there was a very bright line, and we were told certain things just were okay and not okay. And we conformed, a lot of us. I don't think we had the voice that the younger generation has. And we certainly didn't have the numbers that the younger generation has. The millennial generation was, I think, nearly double the size of Generation X. So, you talk about the might of a generation coming into the workplace and insisting on change and just bringing that. It's going to accelerate this work quite a lot. So thank you for that. Yes, really good questions. All these existential questions. Yes. And reflection trigger. Thank you, Cecile. The theory, source of research on the impact of the false self on mental health and well-being. I would argue it hasn't been healthy for a lot of us to compromise a lot of really important things about who we are when we, quote unquote, walk into work. I would agree. I think the costs of covering have been intense. In addition to unconscious bias and all the price we pay on being different. And this is really, I think, where the work needs to go, to say, like, where are certain identities, both visible and invisible, struggling to bring their full selves to work? Where are people putting a lot of energy towards that? And how can we remove those obstacles? How can we interrupt that experience so that people will not only stay here, but actually thrive and build their careers here? And that's, I think, the goal. When I look at management teams that don't look like the rest of the workforce and don't look like the world, I say to myself, clearly the bias has been running unchecked in this organization, and they have not challenged themselves in all the ways that they needed to interrupt the all the sort of micro interruptions that happen and that derail a lot of talent, whether that's female talent, whether that's non-white talent, or people with disabilities. I mean, there's many dimensions that don't fit into the workplace as it's been narrowly defined and set up. And so that's what we need to fix. I think that's the work that's really ahead of us. And so, I just showed you a myriad of both visible and invisible, primary, secondary characteristics, innate, acquired diversity dimensions. And yet, organizations are very much like icebergs, right? We sort of show that 10% that's sanitized or curated or that is mimicking the leaders that we see. And then we hide a lot underneath that waterline. So just looking at this, list of things under the waterline, I'd love to hear in chat, like, what do you spend the most energy covering, or have you spent the most energy covering in the past? And maybe challenge yourself to share at least one thing in chat. Some things I'm always like adding to this list because people come up to me and say, what about this? And what about that? So recently I've added sober and in recovery, which I think is something that, we have to think about, in terms of how we use and meld like alcohol and bar culture and like client mixers after work hours. And this, of course, was pre-pandemic, but who knows what we're going back to. But those of us who might be sober in recovery, it's like, it's not a welcoming atmosphere for us. It's not one that's comfortable for us. So, revisiting the assumptions we've always made about, workplace norms and things that we've done without kind of seeing it through the lens of difference and comfort and safety. Thank you, Shannon. So socioeconomic status. Yep. Absolutely. Whether it's higher, lower than your colleagues, whether it's visible, invisible. Thank you. Age is something and I've heard young people actually will cover their age in the sense that they are managing multi-generational teams. And so sometimes that means they don't want their birthday celebrated at the office or with colleagues, something I don't talk about. I don't talk about life stages because I'm trying to kind of not remind people about my, age cohort. Yes, sexual orientation, absolutely. And by the way, these can move. So sometimes I'll get the question, like, why is race under the waterline? It can be over the waterline or right at the waterline. It can depend, whether you're very like you're comfortable speaking about how you identify, or whether it depends on the situation, or whether you just don't talk about it very much, because it comes with a lot of baggage and potentially difficult conversations when you're in what we say the only and lonely. And often, that's the story we hear. Oh, and thank you so much, Deborah, for sharing. My daughter is disabled. I cover that even, I don't bring that to work. It can be family members, loved ones. It can be addiction in our families. It can be that I'm a single parent, divorced, and that, everybody seems to be biased towards a 2-parent household or a heterosexual parent household, or, I'm raised by my grandparents. All this sort of family stuff that happens behind the scenes is definitely room for covering. Yep. Being in therapy, mental health is an enormous piece to all of this, particularly this year. My hope is the waterline is lowered this year, permanently in some cases. I would like to see it lowered around parenting, like the reality of parenting and the need for flex and support for parents that has never really been effective, at least in the US. And also the prevalence of mental health in our workplaces that we have not been talking about. We haven't been resourcing it, supporting it, naming it, et cetera. Disabilities, both visible and invisible disabilities. Thank you, Heather. It's so true. When I'm looking for another position, I might have worked for a company that felt very progressive so that I could uncover that part of who I am. But when I'm now back on the job market, I worry that it's going to impact my candidacy. Absolutely. So again, these sort of go up and down depending on our situation. Absolutely. So let's keep going here. I appreciate that. This is so fabulous. I love the interaction in chat and I really, really appreciate it. Let me go into privilege a little bit. It's a word that has been weaponized in a lot of conversations, and usually it is associated with white white male people, I might say, or perhaps somebody that looks like me. And some of that is actually true. So my socioeconomic background, the education level I have, the lots of different ways in which I walk through the world mean that I'm protected by levels of privilege, even though I'm an LGBTQ person. My other identities kind of mitigate that or shield it in a way where if I were Black and LGBTQ, if I were trans and LGBTQ, my life would be different. So we have to think about these pieces of all it sort of existing in us. And I just think of privilege simply as something that enables me to move through the world in an easier way, something that gives me permission to speak, something that enables me to challenge things and not be penalized for it in the way that somebody else might be. And this really calls to me in terms of being an individual who both has, marginalized identities of being an LGBTQ woman in a male dominated and very, I would argue heteronormative and cis-normative workplace. But on the same time, I can also be an aspiring ally and thinking about what I can utilize on behalf of and alongside and in solidarity with others. And that feels very motivating to me. It feels like there's something I can do with what I've been given through acquired diversity. So in my case, it comes with perhaps power, it comes with access. It comes with that ease, comfort, safety, all those things. And, I want to quote Kimberly Crenshaw. We should all know, who coined intersectionality. Kimberly Crenshaw is a Black woman professor and really named the overlapping stigmatized identities that many of us carry and the impact of that. In her case and her definition, it's being Black and being a female. And you can add on being LGBTQ to that and think about when we walk in a room, what people can perceive about us, what we can hide about ourselves, and always kind of doing that dance around what is going to be stigmatized about me, what can I hide? And we don't want our colleagues, ourselves. This is very difficult psychological work around belonging. It takes away from our productivity. It takes away from our ability to be present, to be creative, to trust our colleagues, to be trusted by our colleagues when we're constantly navigating this. To me, I don't know about all of you, but I feel like it means I'm working double time. I'm trying to be, a contributing member of an organization and be hopefully brilliant at my work and technically savvy and capable. But I'm also sort of putting all this energy towards ways in which I don't belong. And I think this is the crux of what's lost in terms of this dynamic that we need to address. All right. So, thank you so much. I hope you're all paying attention to chat. It's so fascinating. Yeah, thanks, Ed, for sharing about the jock label. Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating sort of what leads us to belong in a certain group. And again, it's situational, where some things are prized and some things aren't spoken. And, it varies very much company to company. And I would argue even manager to manager. So remember, people leave managers before they leave their jobs in their company. The manager, your day-to-day direct manager, has so much to do with a lot of what we're talking about. So we try to work in my training that we develop for companies. We try to shoot for this middle manager community to say, how can we engage them and how can we equip the middle of the organization to be better and do better on this stuff, because they have so much to do with retaining that new talent, right? I mean, that environment is shaped by that manager. So I tend to work at the top of the house a lot. And that group, tends to be a certain animal in and of itself, but there's a level of understanding the logic of a lot of what we're talking about, but it tends to get kind of watered down in the middle of organizations. So we as change leaders and advocates need to recognize, we need to kind of think about the organization at different tiers with different challenges that are innate to them. And that's what the most effective consultants are really good at doing. And so, my own, if I can take a page from Kimberly Crenshaw and say my own intersectionality and sort of, and put a little asterisk next to it, because I know that I'm not defining it in the purest sense. But I like to think of it as both my intersecting stigmatized identities, but those privileged identities that I shared earlier, and what I can actually do with them. Great. And let me just address one question here. Secondary. There's a question here around secondary aspects of diversity, the acquired ones. Remember the snake chart that I had? And in a room full of what looks like perhaps white, straight, cisgender men, that a lot of diversity dimensions are not visible. I think actually it's not just a group that looks like white, straight men. You look at a group of LGBTQ people and you know everybody identifies as a part of that community. There are a gazillion invisible diversity dimensions in that group. You look at a group full of largely Black identify African American community, tons of diversity dimensions under that waterline too. So interestingly, I think we have to hold both, all of that in our teaching and in how we show up in our understanding and our allyship, which is to say, I think I'm looking at this person and I think I know how they identify, but there is so much they probably are still covering. There's things they can cover, there's things they can't cover, but there's like diversity within the diversity. And that is critical. I can tell you a gazillion ways in which I'm different from almost every other LGBTQ person that I meet. There's no two of us that are the same. And so I love that question. And it's an excellent question. The diversity within the diversity, there's some work that has to be done there too. So I want to make the point that there's colorism, for example, in Black and Brown communities. That is a huge struggle around the status of skin color. There is lots of problems with transphobia and racism and sexism in the LGBTQ community, right? So I might be a cisgender woman in that world, but there tend to be a lot of more cisgender men. I live in New York, and things that we used to go to pre-pandemic, I would be sometimes the only cisgender woman in the room, for example. So there's massive challenges. Just because you're in a marginalized community, historically marginalized community, does not mean that you don't have more work to do from an inclusion perspective. So I'm really glad that somebody asked that. I really appreciate that. Zach, we are not a monolith. Exactly. Nobody is. And I think when we bring our full selves, I think it's incumbent on us to say, I might look like this to you, but I'm this. I'm also this. I'm this, right? To show our full selves is a beacon of understanding for others. When we do that, sharing particularly our invisible aspects of diversity, it literally creates psychological safety for others to do the same. And that's, I think, how we sort of go together and like change organizations in the aggregate, is if all of us sort of take this leap together and bring more of our full selves. Let me check on how I'm doing for time. Hold on. Oh my gosh, I'm almost out of time with all of you. This has been wonderful. If you have questions, keep them coming in the chat, and I'll keep my eye on it. But I do want to share the Inclusive Leader Continuum from the second book, which is how to be an inclusive leader. And again, I'll flash up that slide I started with, plus the QR code at the end of this, and you can screenshot it and download the first chapter of the book. But if you're intrigued by this model, I really recommend you go and check it out. I think it's very helpful to understand where we are. In fact, it's essential that we understand where we are so that we can take the right next step. Thank you, Rick, for sharing that. Thank you. Yeah, the phrase white privilege is one kind of privilege, but like I said, there's a lot of different kinds we have to wrestle with. But that one's a big focus right now. And if any of you have not read Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility book, I would highly recommend it. But also read my book, because I think they provide really good bookends to our work. She really diagnoses a big problem that we've never been able to name before. And then I think my work is around, so where do we go from there? Like, so now that we've had that aha moment, what are all the things we're feeling? And then how do we most importantly move through to progress? Like to grow. So somebody can put White Fragility in the chat if you want with the link. I'd be happy to have somebody share that. Wonderful. So inclusive leadership, this is the way I've been working with it. So in the book, I have this model that I built because I really wanted to equip people with an understanding of where we are and what the journey looks like. And for me, this has been my journey. So it means taking on differences as our own. We will never be able to understand the lived experience of somebody that's not our lived experience, but we can be in solidarity and we can think about the benefits of privileges broadly defined that can be shared, that can be transferred, that can be, um, intentionally put in someone's path, so that we can sort of reconcile that. That's really important. Oh, and thank you, Carlin, for those additional book recommendations. And then without a focus on self. So we talk a lot about centering and decentering ourselves these days. While we want to be proud allies and we want to say, I'm here to help, we want to really resist the whole savior mentality. We want to decenter ourselves and do our work and do a lot of listening, a lot of learning, a lot of study. And what we ideally want to do is elevate stories of others and experiences of others so that we as a collective can grow. So that's what I mean about kind of cautioning us, some of us, against a focus on self. If our identity has been the focus, if we've been in a majority group, right, that is, well understood. And I would argue white culture and I would argue male culture dominates a lot of the environments in which we work. And so the time is now and has been now and before now to elevate different voices, different lived experiences, different leaders, so that we can start to think more broadly about like what does this look like? And that's the work that we've really got to do. Thank you so much for these resources. Fabulous. Good. Love it. Keep putting your favorite books in here while we go and while we wrap up. So just quickly, there's 4 stages to this model, and I'm going to go quickly through this, but unaware is, I don't think there's a problem. Somebody else's job. I see this a lot in companies where it's the diversity team's role, or, oh, I sent everybody through unconscious bias training so we can check the box. It's performative. If it's even there. I mean, I think most companies and most leaders are kind of totally clued out. Maybe apathetic, maybe not understanding there's a problem because there hasn't been a problem for me. So why would there be a challenge for somebody else? So there's a lot of reasons for being an unaware in this model. And I think that what we've got to do is kind of understand, like, why are we here? So I may not understand. I may think I'm a good person. I may think I have good intent. But not understand my impact, right? I think that's part of our awakening out of unaware, to say, like, what am I not understanding about the situation or about my role in it? And I'm a good person. What do you mean? I think everybody feels they have equal opportunity around me. I don't think I would ever say a microaggression, or I have daughters and therefore I understand what gender equity looks like. Not enough. It's just not enough. I mean, being well-intended does not shift organizations. So coming out of unaware means humility. It means openness. It means listening. It means like starting to become aware of things that you may or may not like in terms of looking at ourselves more honestly. So we want to move into phase 2, which is aware, which is basically like, oh my goodness, now I know what I don't know. I have so much to learn, so much to read, listen to, observe. I need to diversify my network of people closest to me because everybody looks like me currently. There's just an enormous amount to learn. And I think this can be an overwhelming stage, particularly this year. Everything we've learned and taken in, particularly if this is kind of new information for a lot of us. And so aware is critical. And we may stay here for a while. We may really be deep into our learning. And we also start to question our intent versus impact, to say, well, what impact do I have? I might be a well-meaning person and I might believe in this stuff, but I actually don't know if I'm making a difference to others. I think we need to start to get curious at this phase. And then what do we do with awareness in phase 2? Well, we need to activate around it. It's not enough to just go to unconscious bias training and then say, I'm done. It's, what are you going to do with it? So I'm starting to find my voice. I shift my priorities. I start to use different language. I start to put myself out there. I start to not want to cause harm with my awkwardness as I'm learning this new skill or developing this new muscle. And I'm holding myself accountable for progress and growth. And I think this is a really exciting phase. It can be be terrifying because we're trying to do something new. We're trying to be more public. We're trying to share our diversity story, right? Those invisible aspects of diversity, and it can feel very stumbling, very awkward. And it also can feel very risky when it's not a comfortable place for you. But it's important to stay here and be here and experiment with this. Really, really good. And I think people get stuck here. So let's think about like, how do we not get stuck here and move along and develop a new muscle? Because it only comes from practice and you're going to get things wrong for sure. In fact, probably more wrong than right. And we don't need to be fragile, to use Robin's words about this. We don't need to be sort of all up in our emotions about it. The important thing is to take feedback and be better, and easier said than done, I understand. But there's just so much, we need to get past that and really progress. And then finally, advocate is phase 4. So this is literally challenging systems, asking inconvenient questions, being unafraid, always asking, why did we do it this way? Why did it happen this way? What can we address at the systems level so that this doesn't happen again? So that's really the advocate mindset. And it's very advanced. It's literally, you're the squeaky wheel. You don't care who, feels uncomfortable. You're challenging your peers, people that look like you, if you have a position of power or privilege, and you're using your voice, then you're sort of in there constantly. And you're leveraging what you have. So yeah, I went quickly through that. If you read the book, you'll see this elaborated on in the pages of the book. I think you'll really enjoy it. And I did want to flash this up again, particularly the inclusive leader assessment, that bottom bullet. The code is JB Speaks, so make a note of that. And that will take about 10 minutes. It's free. And it will give you a report on the stages where we think you are. It's a quick assessment, so it's not perfect. But I wanted to also say, before I lose you all, that we can be a lot of different places at any given time on that continuum. So it's not an absolute. It depends what identity we're considering. So for me, I'm probably unaware into aware about certain communities that I'm really making an effort to learn about. Mental health is one. Is not something that touches me directly, but something that I need to be able to teach about, something that I need to be able to represent in what I say. So, while I may be advocate level for LGBTQ, I am still really an apprentice and very junior in my understanding about people with disabilities and mental health issues and the trans community. So you can be in many different places. And I wanted you all to know that's not just okay, but that's where all of us are. And the important thing is just to put that learning plan together, to work your muscle, to make sure you're moving forward. You have that discipline, you're holding yourself accountable, and that we are activating our voice on behalf of and alongside those who have not been heard and seen. And if that means us, also, can be both and, right? We're doing this simultaneously because we can walk and chew gum at the same time. So thank you so, so much.
If you enjoyed the session, make sure to give us a thumbs up. Also, if you want to hear more from the School of Becoming, head over to schoolofbecoming.org and subscribe to our email, where we will inform you about upcoming live sessions that you can attend to not only listen to what our amazing guests have to say, but also interact with them as well as with our audience.